welcome to this wonderful session on democratizing climate law and governance capacity. In this session, we are going to focus on the state of climate law and governance, education and capacity strengthening efforts worldwide, and especially try to identify what more is needed. With over 169 of 186 NDCs explicitly prioritizing legal and institutional reform, and so many of them depending on law and governance capacity that doesn't yet exist in order to be implemented, we have to address the question of how to scale up skilled climate law and governance specialists globally. Indeed, in Glasgow, we took on a commitment as the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, all the partners of this day, to help to move from 600 approximately climate law and governance specialists who exist today to 6,000 by 2024. It's a stretch target, and it's only a drop in the bucket of what's needed. And so this session in particular will focus on the roles of leading international organizations, universities, commissions, institutes, and especially Global South training centers in order to be able to underline climate law and governance capacity needs worldwide and come up with plans for ways to be able to achieve our pledge of 600 to 6,000 in the year that remains. So I'm very, very pleased to be chairing this session together with some dear friends, new and old, on these issues. I know that we will be joined shortly by Professor Robert Kibugi, who is still just finishing teaching a climate law and governance class in Kenya. So I think that's probably about the best reason ever to not be able to make it right at the beginning of this panel. But we're going to hear a few words from my co-chair, who is doing climate law and governance capacity building in Liberia at the moment. And he's actually in the field today with no internet, but he was able before the bus left to film a short greeting for you. So I'm going to ask Maeve if she would be kind enough to play Damilola's short greeting, and then we'll proceed right to our keynote speaker, who you heard from very briefly this morning and has a great deal of exciting ideas to share. Damilola. Let me guess, there's sight but not sound? Yeah, everyone's having the same problem. All right, I think Dami will be giving closing remarks for this panel rather than opening it. And our colleagues will sort out the sound in the meantime. I will proceed directly. You know that I'm a take no prisoners person with technology. If it's not working, it's gone. And I'm going to proceed directly to introduce our keynote speaker. She really requires no introduction because she was one of our opening speakers as well. But Dr. Ilaria Bottigliero has been working for many years in this area. She's authored key pieces. She's helped to design and implement capacity building programs all over the world in the most vulnerable, most highly climate vulnerable and poorest areas. She's also led training, research, and development work globally for many years as Director of Research for the International Development Law Organization. So I'm extremely pleased. Her full bio is of course available in the bios on the websites as is everyone else's, but I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce her very briefly and ask her if she could maybe give us 6 or 7 minutes of just her ideas on the answers to our focused questions. Thank you, Ilaria.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Marie-Claire. Again, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Special thanks to you, to the organizers of this wonderful event and conference. It's great to be surrounded by activists, by academics, by practitioners, university experts. It's really the type of environment that really helps answering the most difficult questions. Now, Marie-Claire, you just gave us a huge challenge. How do we scale up from 600 to 6,000 by 2024? I mean, that's no joke. And of course, we're here to give our contribution, but it does need a lot of thinking and a lot of action and financing, of course, and all type of hands and contributions, because this is something that we cannot do alone, but we know that having an approach that is based on rule of law, on justice, on good governance is absolutely essential. And this is really what we are also trying to put forward as an idea, as a concept from the International Development Law Organization, IDLO, which is where I am working. So thank you for having invited IDLO to this session. And as I was mentioning today, in the opening session, as a cross-cutting issue with really disproportionate effects on vulnerable and marginalized people, climate change is not just an environmental or an ecological concern. It really undermines progress towards human rights, towards a sustainable development, in addition to posing a real threat to the future of our life in the planet. I also mentioned this morning something I really believe is that the consequences of climate change are more keenly felt by those who are the most vulnerable and dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods and daily lives. And these are also the people who have the least capacity to respond and adapt to the challenges of climate change. And also, additionally, these are the most excluded from the exercise of power. So when we are thinking about moving from 600 to 6,000 or other ambitious climate targets, we do need to focus. We do need to concentrate on those who need this support the most and who will suffer the most if we don't receive that support. So even if in our training of the judiciary, judges, lawyers, paralegals, etc., we do need to give that focus on the most vulnerable, not only to support them access, for example, legal aid or access justice more generally, but to empower the most vulnerable to know their rights and realize their rights. And this is something I will discuss a little bit later. So at IDLO, we very much believe that the causes and effects of climate change are strictly linked to issues of justice and equity. They cannot be disconnected. So as such, justice issues must be part of the solution to achieve a fair, inclusive, and climate secure future for people and for the planet. Now, the question that you correctly raised, Marie-Claire, is, okay, these are all nice words. We all believe in that. We're all with you. But how do we do it concretely? How do we move from theory to practice? Well, at IDLO, we have been doing a bit of thinking also with your support and the support of many other experts. We thought that if we follow a three-pillar approach on our work on climate justice, perhaps we could get good results and hopefully some impact. So our work at the moment focuses on empowering the most climate vulnerable people to realize environmental rights and actively participate in decision-making processes. And I'll explain a little bit later what that means. We are also working on investing in people-centered laws and institutions for climate resilient development. And we're also working on improving the governance of land and other natural resources with a focus on enhancing land rights and sustaining peace. So let me, in a very few minutes, unpack a little bit these concepts and see if I can be as practical as possible to see what action is needed really to leverage these ideas. Now, the first focus area has to do with empowering the most climate vulnerable people, recognizing that people who are the most vulnerable to climate change are often those least able to access justice or to make their voices heard in governance processes. So climate change aggravates existing inequalities and produces different effects on the human rights of different groups. So we think that an intergenerational, intersectional, gender-sensitive approach to climate action is necessary to understand that distinct consequences of climate change on diverse groups actually exist, and to ensure that solutions are capable of producing just and effective outcomes. For these reasons, our climate justice work is not indiscriminate, let's say, but we decided to focus on women and girls, youth and children, indigenous people, and local communities, and climate migrants. We are a relatively small organization, so it's better to focus. The second focus area, investing in people-centered laws and institutions for climate resilient development, acknowledges that climate justice requires fair and effective regulatory frameworks that strengthen accessibility and accountability. For this reason, we support institutions to develop regulatory frameworks and justice sector capacity development, but also to foster rule of law approaches to climate finance, including also reducing corruption and illicit financial flows, increasing access to justice, addressing gender inequalities in climate finance, and delivering on loss and damage. And then finally, I wanted to mention a little bit our work on improving governance on land and other natural resources, recognizing that billions of people rely directly on land and natural resources, such as water and forests, and that climate change drives up competition for land and water, which in turn, of course, fuels dispossession, land grabbing, criminal exploitation of land and natural resources, conflict and displacement. So we believe that to prevent conflict and sustain peace, we really need to improve the governance of land and natural resources. Now, these are just some highlights of what we think we should be focusing on. Of course, we cannot do it alone. We need to do it in partnership. So that's why I'm also very happy to be part of this discussion and to continue working with all of you to make this happen. So with that, looking forward to the discussion, Marie-Claire, thank you again. And I'm here to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I should just highlight that the legal specialization course that we host on Sundays during negotiations of the Paris Agreement were incredibly difficult to hold without treading on the toes of independence and neutrality. And it was IDLO's methodology all those years that we used to be able to provide that training in a way that was respectful and professional to all the delegates, no matter their different perspectives, and help them to build bridges, perhaps contributing in some small way to the Paris Agreement itself and also the successful conclusion of the rule book finally. So with that, I would like to thank Ilaria. I understand that Damilola's brief message from the wilds of Liberia is now able to be played. And then I will turn directly to Ayman Cherkawi, who deserves a very warm congratulations from his entire community that is going to be delivered today. So do you want to try one more time with the video from Dami?
Thank you very much for joining this panel, and I bring you compliments and warm regards from Liberia, where I'm currently on mission. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this expert panel on democratizing climate law and governance capacity. Addressing the problem of climate change will require strategic approaches that mainstream climate change into all aspects of decision making and at all levels. And to be able to do that, there is a need to build capacity to ensure that those at the local levels have the ability to understand climate instruments and the ability to implement them with all vigor and with all skill that is required to address the problem of climate change in line with the goals and targets of the Paris Agreement. So this panel will examine how we can enhance capacity for the implementation and the democratization of climate law and governance. And some of the questions that we will be looking at will include: what is the state of climate law and governance education and capacity strengthening efforts worldwide, and what more is needed? With over 169 out of 186 NDCs explicitly prioritizing legal and institutional reform, how can we then scale up skilled climate law and governance specialists globally from 600 to 6,000 by the year 2024? And what will be the roles of leading universities, experts, commissions, and institutes in ensuring this rapid acceleration of climate change capacity, especially legal capacity to understand, mainstream, and implement climate change instruments? It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome a roster of distinguished scholars and experts that will help us understand and unpack these issues. And of course, without taking much of their time, I will pass it on to my co-chair, Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger, Executive Secretary, CLGI, Senior Director, CISDL.
Thank you. And I will send my thanks to Damilola as well. I really hope his mission is successful. I know it's very important work. I'm going to turn directly to two of our younger next generation leaders who are involved in answering that huge challenge that we have sitting in front of us, which is our pledge of 600 to 6,000 in 2 years. And if we get a 1-year extension, that's still going to be a big stretch and only a drop in the bucket of what's needed. They've agreed to give us 6 slides on the work that Ayman and others who are here online have led. And then we're going to turn to Ayman and then to Megan and then to Robert to hear their expert commentary in order, and to hear their ideas going forward for what is needed. So Tejas and Maeve, if you'd like to briefly make a presentation.
Good morning. My name is Maeve McDermott. I'm an associate fellow and assistant researcher at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, one of the coordinators for the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, and a legal researcher for Williamson Law and Policy. I'm immensely grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all to discuss democratizing climate law and governance capacity, along with advocate Tejas Rao.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Tejas Rao, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and a research assistant with the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the university, as well as manager for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. And I will be presenting together with Maeve.
In the first week of COP27, we have witnessed an emphasis on the need for implementation of existing In the first week of COP27, we have witnessed an emphasis on the need for implementation of existing climate action plans and the nationally determined contributions. The executive secretary of the UN Climate Change stated that Sharm El Sheikh is going to be the COP that shifts us from creating the plan for climate change mitigation and adaptation to actually implementing that plan. Last month, the executive secretary also emphasized that climate action plans would need to be strengthened and implemented in the next 8 years if we have any chance of staying on track to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius worldwide. So the focus of this year's Climate Law and Governance Day, which is on implementing climate commitments through policy, law, and practice, was very well chosen. According to the recently released 2022 NDC synthesis report, 74% of parties to the Paris Agreement identified capacity building as a prerequisite to implementing their nationally determined contributions, which indicates how critical capacity strengthening is for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Among the many different forms that capacity strengthening can take, climate law and governance education and capacity strengthening is particularly needed in fighting climate change. Over 169 of the 186 parties to the Paris Agreement have stressed in their nationally determined contributions the importance of legal and institutional reforms, and more than 60 countries have emphasized in their NDCs that exponential increases in law and governance capacity and practice on all levels are crucial for implementation and compliance. As we are all aware, there is a growing interest in climate law and governance. The number of climate litigation cases around the world continues to grow each year. Another indicator of the growing interest in climate law and governance is this year's Climate Law and Governance Day, which had unprecedented registrant numbers. With the exponentially growing need to strengthen climate law and governance capacity, coupled with the growing interest in this area, it is no surprise that the number of university courses focused on climate law and governance or touching upon climate law within their curriculum is growing each year. Throughout the past decades, we have seen more and more law schools offering courses on environmental law. Now we are beginning to see courses emerge at law schools around the world that are focused specifically on climate change law, such as a special topic course titled International Climate Change Law and another special topic course titled Climate Change and the Law, both offered by Victoria University of Wellington Faculty of Law. Vermont Law and Graduate School has offered a climate justice practicum for its students since 2020, and Yale Law School is now also offering a climate fellows course. However, a preliminary pilot survey of law schools and law faculties in a group of common law English-speaking countries indicated that less than 57% of the schools assessed offered courses on climate law and governance to their students. Further study to more comprehensively understand the current state of climate law and governance education and capacity strengthening efforts worldwide is highly needed so that these efforts can be adequately scaled up.
The issue with current climate law and governance offerings is broadly that they sit on the side of course curriculums at the moment and not at the center. Very often, as Maeve mentioned, a large number of these are special offerings or certificate courses or voluntary courses offered on the side of the entire curriculum, including the ever popular fireside chats at the University of Cambridge. So the question then becomes, what can we actually do to further scale up this capacity for legal and institutional climate reform, and not only as an optional paper and not only for individuals who are able to access this at universities? It starts off with the chain of investment, which is investing in climate law and governance courses as well as educational programs. This does not only mean at the university itself, but through the offering of massive online open courses and professional continuing education on climate change law and governance, as well as the SDGs, at low or no cost options to enable climate conscious decision making at all levels, from the everyday to the business leaders. The important part about massive online open courses is that they also offer the opportunity for peer learning and the building of communities of practice. More critically, it also enables us to translate material in real time and translate resources that are offered through these massive open online courses, making them more accessible to all. As we can see from this year's Climate Law and Governance Day, which is also offering interpretation sessions to make things available to everyone in Middle East and North Africa. Furthermore, it is really critical that we establish networks of experts and communities of practice for the academics that teach these climate law courses by offering training and professional continuing development for them as well. The judges have established this with the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, as well as the Environment Law Institute's course on climate justice. That makes it possible for them to meet frequently and discuss the state of climate change decision-making. Academics should also be offered this same opportunity. Finally, on the third scale, it is really critical that climate law is integrated into the study of traditional law subjects. We've seen how there is overlap in tort law, for example, with climate law today, and overlap with contract law and climate law. It is integral that these subjects are taught hand in hand, and that climate law courses start to have a more broad-reaching interdisciplinary focus. Finally, to push on this momentum, it is critical to research further on the global state of climate law and governance education and capacity strengthening efforts to ensure that we are able to innovate and continuously develop this momentum forward. Next slide, please. The question then becomes, how do you measure this progress? And what tangible outcomes can we see from this investment? And what is critical is what is helpful is the Climate Law and Governance Initiative's Climate Pledge Registry. The registry stems from the already mentioned pledge in Glasgow to increase climate law and governance capacity worldwide from 600 to 6,000 legal specialists by 2024, with the names, countries, as well as practicing titles of everyone who is registers being included on a public registry of climate law and governance specialists accessible to all. We've included here the link to that registry, and we urge you to encourage your peers, as well as anyone who identifies as a climate law expert, to register today. Importantly, what we gain through massive open online courses, as well as the building of communities of practice, is a larger number of individuals who are comfortable calling themselves climate lawyers and practice climate law in their everyday decision-making. This is critical to the success and scaling up of climate law and governance capacity. With that, we thank you for your time and conclude this presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the work that you're doing, not just to help build this, but also to track how you're building it, which is equally important for all of us. Without further ado, I'd like to turn with a very special congratulations to one of the leaders in our field for the last decade. I'm speaking, of course, of advocate Ayman Choukawi. He served as CISDL's legal counsel since they hosted the Marrakesh COP. And for that, helping to negotiate the Paris Agreement and then helping to ensure its rapid entry into force. I think he was really the driving voice behind that work. He's had an immense influence on international affairs. We're particularly happy today to celebrate one of our own, not just as Deputy Chair of the IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law, not just as the CISDL Lead Counsel and a chair of this entire initiative, but also because he has just recently taken up a new role as Director of the Hassan II Environmental Training Center of Morocco, which indeed supports all of Africa. So Ayman, first, congratulations, warmest of congratulations from your whole community. And then second, please, let us know what you think should be done.
Thank you very much, Marika, for this very nice and very kind and generous introduction. Many of us have engaged in this process for a long time, and as you once told me, it is almost an epistemic community of stakeholders that are supporting one another and making sure that we progress, no matter what the context may be, in terms of meeting the objectives of the Paris Agreement and more broadly the 2030 agenda. So thank you very much for that. So regarding my comments on this particular panel that we are all part of right now, I'll start with the CISDL hat, if I may, but I don't have much to add to the excellent presentation that was just shared right now by Maeve and Tejas, other than to encourage everyone really to peruse the registry. That is an important component of ensuring that we keep that ambitious pledge that was made in Glasgow. But there was a reason that this pledge was ambitious, because very much needed for us to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. As America, you often said, it is about courage, and courage that is matched by ambition, so that we can implement at a scale, at the pace that is required to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement all over the world, particularly, as Ilaria was saying, in the service of the most vulnerable all over the world, in particular in the global south. So regarding the CISDL, there's also, I don't believe it was specifically mentioned in precision, but just the day after tomorrow, we'll also be organizing a specialization course that will be taking place. It's a bit of a tradition. We do it alongside the COPs. We've been doing that for quite some time. I've had the pleasure and privilege of being more engaged around the adaptation component of that course. And we can only encourage you to, if you have yet to engage in this course, to take part in it. As Marika was saying, we've been very keen to follow processes and methods. We are not perceived and beyond perception, that we are also not in any way perceived and taking any position that is not neutral, given the fact that all of us are coming from different perspectives that enrich one another, and we also are having this particular session taking place alongside the COP, where negotiations are ongoing. So it is of distance from that. With the hat of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, Many of you, including Marie-Claire and others, took part in the Oslo International Environmental Law Conference that took place just a few weeks ago. It was an important opportunity to reconnect and also to build capacity, assess the current state of knowledge when it comes to environmental law, and push the boundaries of that particular knowledge while supporting, in particular, research with a specific focus on early career. We have a specialist group on early career. That was an important focus of Christina's vision for the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law that is chaired by Marina and Alvin. Just later today, we'll be meeting with some of them that are here, and we have engaged in terms of making sure that they are in a position to take part in person to COP27 here in Glasgow. We have blogs, publication, of course, activities and webinars. Then finally, regarding the Hassan II International Environmental Training Center, which is the academic arm of the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection, which is chaired by Her Royal Highness Princess Anna Hasna. Thank you very much for your congratulations, Marie-Claire. I've been in the capacity for just a few months now, but we have done quite a bit already. We have been doing quite a bit for several years now. We're very keen to do more. Very happy to engage in partnerships in that regard. Just to give you some examples of what we have done, in the context of climate finance, for example, which is a deep worry, has been for quite some time, but here has been a deep focus of conversations. Last year in December, we launched a series of national regional workshops in Morocco. We have done 12 of them, the 12th of which actually took place, finished just the day before yesterday. We'll have a series of webinars in November and a national workshop in December. And we've been engaging at the local level with public decision makers, with engineers, with administrators, with even gardeners, really, with all layers of people that are committed at the local level, because we want to make sure that the local level, at the regional level, we have that capacity, which is transformational and connected to the ground. And as such, we have a 3-day workshop looking at climate finance in a manner that is adapted to the regional context and also identify resources and opportunities, whether it is at the international level, but also when it comes to domestic resource mobilization. We have a partnership with UNEP. We are hearing Patricia in the opening remarks earlier. So together with United Nations Environment Program, the center has a secretariat of the African Green work. We have been engaged in the Race to Zero, Race to North of the MENA Regional Climate. Yesterday in the Morocco Pavilion, we had the workshop looking at the climate knowledge gaps in Africa and the opportunities to deepen and raise awareness about what already exists, but also develop new knowledge products. So we have the African Youth Climate Hub as well, where last year, as part of Glasgow COP26, we launched a MOOC in partnership with Yungo, the official youth and children constituency of UNFCCC, as well as the UNFCCC and UNCP group, a MOOC on climate change in Africa with 40 modules. We are going to be launching next week the development of a new MOOC looking at water in that context in Africa. And of course, there are many legal and governance implications connected to that, and we'll be very happy to engage with the community in that regard. So I hope I wasn't too long. There's more to do. There's a lot that's being done, but there's always more to do. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the rest. And actually, I want to introduce a dear friend of our community. Here, Marie-Claire. Hello. And Rick. Please come say hi to Marie-Claire. We're in the middle of a session on capacity building. Oh, there she is. She's here in Sharm El Sheikh. Hello.
Yeah. We're in climate law and governance day. This is so blue zone. Like I'm, you know, this is reminding me of the COPs, all the COPs and how it happens, including with, you know, internet failing, queues with monoxide, you know, not enough people, not enough coffee, you know, yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Ayman, especially for highlighting not just what is being done, but also what more there is to do. I think that everyone here on this call and indeed in this session is interested in developing and building on those partnerships with you. And it's certainly an exciting time. Now, I'd like to go straight to somebody else who is doing equal work in a different context, and in particular, given that Glasgow and the UK were our hosts last year for the COP26 and did such an amazing job with it. I think we are really very honored and very, very grateful that Dr. Megan Bowman, who of course leads the Climate Law and Governance Centre at King's College at University of London, has been able to join us and talk to us about her efforts. And Megan, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I'm afraid I know your doctoral students. And when your doctoral students hero worship you and talk about you the way yours do, it's the highest possible recommendation for an academic. So now that I've made you blush, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie-Claire. And thank you also to Dami and to Tejas and Maeve. I know how much work you put into this day, and how important this day is for all those involved and for all that it portends. So thank you to all of you for your hard work in bringing us all together. In my comments, I really just want to back up really what Ilaria and Ayman have already said so eloquently, and also in Tejas's and Maeve's presentation as well. So the really, I think the key message right now is that climate change touches on every area of law, regulation, and governance. It is no longer, if it ever was, it can no longer be conceived of as a niche or peripheral area. Perhaps confined to the parameters of environmental law, for example, or even public international law. So it touches on corporate law, commercial law, contract law, tort law, human rights law, procurement law, investment law, constitutional law, financial regulation, and it goes on. And the implications, I think, of if we can really truly understand that, then the implications are massive for the way that we teach, for the way that we practice, and for the way we interact, and for the relational implications of that as well. So one of the really interesting things, I think, is the implications for practice in this respect. And I'm talking not just about legal practice, but I'm also talking about industry and market practice, that climate change is now on the balance sheet. It is a material financial risk and opportunity. And we see that, I think, that's what we're talking about is the mainstreaming of these issues. That is my point in a nutshell. And I sort of want to pick up on some of Ayman's points, particularly around the climate finance, sustainable finance point, because it's a really, first of all, it's super duper important, obviously, for actually implementing the Paris Agreement. But secondly, it's such a lovely petri dish to kind of have a look at this notion of what was once peripheral becoming mainstream and ubiquitous. And that is, of course, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, an article that I love, that I've talked about before, and I'm not going to stop talking about it. I know that it's also very much on the negotiations agenda for this COP as well. And of course, in that article, it says the words making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And the broadest interpretation of that, an interpretation that I hold and advocate, and many around me as well do, particularly in industry, is that is, again, not just niche environmental projects, but all finance for all things must be flowing in the same green, sustainable, resilient direction. And that means the end of business as usual as we currently conceive it. So the implications of that are huge, and huge for markets, huge for industry, but also huge for us, because the role of national law and regulation to this endeavour, to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, to the achievement of nationally determined contributions, to ending business as usual as we currently conceive it, is critical. So the role of national law and regulation particularly is critical. And I think, I could go on and on. I have another, I don't need to go on and on about the different ways that law and regulation can be conceived in this space in concrete terms. But what I can say in the few moments that I have, something I want to emphasize more, which is the indirect impact and effects of law and regulation for inculcating longer-term behavioural change within and across society and sectors. And it does that by messaging, by setting new norms and expectations. Law and regulation tells us what is acceptable and what is not. So that messaging, that normative messaging that comes from law and regulation, regardless of its instrumental objectives, is less talked about, but just as important as the instrumental objectives. And that collective behavioral change, that systems change, is really what we need now more than ever. So I really can't emphasize enough. So my first point being climate change touches on everything. My second point being the importance of national law and regulation to the Paris Agreement and climate endeavor generally. And my third point that I really want to make, and my final point, is the role of lawyers and legal experts as educators, as advisors, as advocates, and as agents of change. These are our critical roles that we play in helping to move this forward, helping to reconceive business as usual. So as educators, well, every word that Ayman said, there you go. The CISDL course that Marie-Claire mentioned, all the details in Maeve and Tatehouse's presentation as well. And I loved in their presentation the highlighting between the discrete modules and MOOCs and so forth on climate change and related topics, but also what is just as important is the sort of the infiltration, it sounds a bit dramatic, the dissemination of climate and sustainability related learning throughout traditional courses. So something that we're just beginning at King's actually is putting a sustainable finance unit into the commercial law course, for example. And that's something I just did literally, last month. And
with you on that one. So it is actually something we've done in Canada. We just created a new undergrad program on financial management and sustainability. And we were absolutely shocked. 700 students signed up, for 40 places. And that's undergrad. They're going to be studying it for 4 years, accounting, business management, and sustainability. And they're going to come out ready to go. Yeah.
Well, I think this is wonderful. And this is, because we can't underestimate either the appetite for this. The world is changing, and it needs to change. By 2030, we need to have halved global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a lot of change in a short period of time, and I think students and learners have the appetite for this, as you've just sort of shown, Marie-Claire. So everyone's, they get it and everyone's on board. So I think but it's a challenge as well, because I say everyone's on board, but that's actually optimistic. Not everyone is on board. So it's I think educating ourselves and colleagues as much as any of the students, obviously. And as advisors, of course, we're advisors of CEOs, of boards of directors, of companies, of governments, of current and future lawmakers. And that can be in direct relationship, but it can also be, through research and publications. So I think that's really important. Obviously, our role as advocates, the ever-increasing climate-related litigation around the world in a variety of spheres, from constitutional to financial. And then finally, our role as agents of change, and I think that is something to embrace, even with the principles of neutrality that we try to adhere to. I think imperative for us is to help shepherd in this brave new business as usual.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. And I'm going to ask Barbara to come straight in on this, because she, as UNESCO chair and vice rector of one of the main universities in Almaty, has been leading climate change education. I've been to her courses teaching in that environment in the Aral Sea area is, speaking of courage, just quite amazing. And watching the students respond to her, not just your students in classes, but also the young policymakers and lawmakers that come to your courses each year. Barbara, you probably need no introduction, and this was a very friendly and informal introduction, but please, you're extremely welcome, and let me hand the microphone to you.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. Indeed, that's a very good point also to discuss this topic, because right now our 7th course on climate and law in the water sector is finishing. So actually I would like to speak a very quick note on this. As I understand, one of the focuses of COP27, which is adaptation, and especially in the field of water. And as Megan mentioned, actually climate law, it touches about all of the different areas of law. So I would like to draw your attention a little bit to water law in the conjunction, of course, of the climate law, because this is one of the main fields. And as we see, the progress in relation to water to achieve the Agenda 2030 is very low, is drastically low, and the importance of governance for the adaptation, and here it would be law, policy, and especially capacity building, is increasingly recognized. I think that's a very important message, but we have at the same time quite many challenges. I keep them general, but they exactly fit into the context of Central Asia, and that's what we are doing over our courses. So we are challenged in the terms of the scale when we think about climate and water law. When we see that water law needs to be applied on the national, probably also on the local level. It's cross-sectoral, so it touches upon not only water, but also agriculture, also on the energy, industry, environment. All of these fields of environmental law come together to serve this purpose. I mean, to try to understand the climate challenge in our region, but absolutely overall beyond. So the scale, then when we think about the timing and we look at law and consider that law, it takes time to develop law, right? And people might change. And in this sense, we need to start our capacity building again over and over. We need to teach them how to make the law adaptable, because the law is sometimes like a little bit carved in stone, and people who we teach over the courses might try to adapt it, at least in their practice. Also, that's a challenge for the countries which sometimes have a little capacity of lawmaking and law implementation. So that's also, again, a part that we build the capacities to ensure that the law is implemented in the right form. And then finally, I mean, scale, timing, and the implementation itself. So what is written, not always, as I mentioned, as reflecting the reality. So capacity for the people is needed. People not, I mean, at least in such regions like this one, they really need this development, especially in such a new field. And there are very few lawyers dealing with such issues. And then there's a need for coordination among the sectors when we implement adaptation on climate change in the water sector. Again, as I mentioned, it comes all together. So we suddenly become not only water experts, but also an expert in energy and agriculture and all of that from the legal perspective. And the solution is, first of all, the challenges in knowledge sharing and trying to secure also evidence base for the decision makers who we teach, that we can really ensure them that what we are talking is not just generally blah blah, or it's maybe good for Europe or for US, but not for Central Asia. So that's where we need to also to have a very clear evidence for what we teach. Of course, we must try to help them to adapt this law. I mean, the interpretation of the existing law like a living process, and teach them, because very often they are the decision makers. And even if now they are young, soon they will be and are now involved already in the law setting, law drafting mechanisms. And we have to always call for accountability, transparency, participation. I think that's the part which is true for every part of law and accumulated in the the climate law to achieve this goal. And just an example, as we started from, I finished with that we here in Central Asia organize in Almaty organize a course already for 7 years where we take young civil servants nominated from all the different ministries from all around the region, from 6 countries. If we went to take Afghanistan, all around the basin of the Aral Sea, which I think is unfamous enough in the world, not to repeat this. And I also see there is a lot of commitment of international organizations or of Germany, because we are German Kazakh University, towards this push for the education in the field of climate, and especially with the focus on law for different groups, be it civil servants, or as we do in our standard teaching, regular students from bachelor and master coming from different countries. And there is an understanding that they have to come together to really acquire this, not only interdisciplinary, but also kind of interstate knowledge, so that they respect their own each other's interests, and on that top they can build flexible and efficient legal framework for the whole region to tackle the climate change. Thank you very much.
Wow, tour de force. Robert, I hate to do this to you, but you're going to have to follow on those 3 incredible women and also on Ayman. Luckily, I know you're more than capable of it. Warmest of welcomes to Professor Robert Kibugi from the University of Nairobi. He has worked with us for many years. He has led and chaired the IUCN Academy and the work of the World Commission on Environmental Law training. And then he's also led IDLO training, and he has served as an expert to many different governments and international organizations, not only throughout his region, but around the world. So I introduced you as a senior legal fellow of the CISDL, but I think you have also quite a few other hats that are just equally or much more distinguished. And we're very, very happy to have you with us. We did explain to the participants that you were actually teaching a class, and so you are joining us just a little bit later. Please do, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marie-Claire, and it's a pleasure as usual to be on this distinguished panel. And of course, coming in after the other colleagues have spoken, I realize that we are all in the same frame of mind in terms of building capacity concerning climate change governance. And I would like to focus my remarks on about 3 or 4 key areas, and I'll speak to them fairly quickly. One of the things that seems to occur to me and somewhat surprised me until recently is the fact that merely what we would otherwise think is a fairly straightforward concept central to climate action is not that obvious, particularly to policymakers. And I'm speaking about the whole idea of climate change mainstreaming. And the fact that this is very integral to ensuring that climate actions, climate considerations are taken across different areas of governance. And as we know, much of economic development actions are actually drivers of climate change or contribute to worsening vulnerability or lessening resilience unless dedicated action of climate screening and interventions and financing is taken. And so if you ask me which one I would consider to be an important area of building climate capacity across the, for public officers and those involved across the board, is to revisit and reinforce the understanding of mainstreaming, moving it away from, the level of us academics into more practical case study driven experiences, so that it is very clear, for instance, to Kenya's Minister of Finance, what it means to screen budget proposals for climate action and what it means to screen economic plans for climate action, and to have a very good understanding that we, for instance, we are able to screen and realize the true reality of climate financing by screening and separating it from regular budget allocations and finance allocations to see the value added or the impact this has on mitigation or adaptation actions. So that is one area one approach that I would consider critical, regardless of the level of training and capacity building. But the second one is to identify areas of unique intervention. And coming from the African continent, I do recognize that there are various areas around mitigation that are important, but I would focus my attention a lot around areas of vulnerability and resilience and adaptive capacity, areas that present unique weakness and vulnerability where capacity building in terms of substantive knowledge is required. And one of the most common areas is the science policy interface. You'll be surprised about the number of people who would be saying that they are talking about climate change, but really they are speaking about environment. And the high degree of misunderstanding of the science around climate vulnerability, around greenhouse gas or emissions, etc. So that climate science policy interface, I think, is quite important. The second area to me is interpretation of that science policy interface in a meaningful manner towards legislative drafting or interpretation of existing laws for implementation. Yet again, this is one of the areas where there is a need for a significant interdisciplinarity to work and to build capacity so that people actually know what is it when we say we are going to draft legislation or policy, what is the content and what is the responses that we are putting in place. One of the biggest risks around climate legislation today is to try to over-provide, yet the science itself is changing in a fairly dynamic manner. And so how do you actually do this in a meaningful way that will serve a country for generations? The third one is loss and damage, and we can speak about this forever. I think it even held up the plenary of the COP from getting started the other day. And loss and damage, I think, remains the big elephant in the room. My PhD students discussing environmental liability are currently trying to digest attribution studies, for example, and they're quite difficult to understand. And this is another area that is unique. I think I can say financing and say no more because I think that's been spoken about. But I wanted to speak about an area that we often don't pay attention to. Children, the best interest of the child in light of climate change. Right now, I think recently in the city of Delhi, schools have had to be closed twice because of pollution. And various other vulnerabilities that will arise facing children that are not quite considered generally and more specifically in policy making and in the knowledge industry, and of course disaster risk reduction, etc. The third approach, so the first approach was to focus on mainstreaming. The second one was to identify areas of unique interest and focus. The third approach is we need to reinforce established areas of governance that can lend their strengths to climate change governance and climate action. And without much, I would speak about the human rights system and its unique strengths, positive duties of states on states and other actors. Some of those areas are very unique, that they can enhance understanding and distribute areas of winning. And the fourth area is to focus on the type of knowledge that we are looking to generate or to disseminate as part of capacity building. In my view, we have to be very careful not to go back to the era of transplanting knowledge into societies, knowledge that doesn't fit. There is need to have a great deal of respect for endogenous knowledge, a great deal of respect for indigenous and traditional knowledge, and of course significant respect and appreciation for interdisciplinarity and peer learning. Not to mean that peer learning is not important, but the risk of transplanting looks likely to return in large scale. And my final point is the manner of capacity building. Being a university teacher, like most people, I am a fan of creating courses relating to climate change at the Faculty of Law of the University of Nairobi. We have two, at the bachelor's level and at Master of Laws level. So this is useful because then we create a cohort of champions, of young lawyers who understand the details and mechanics around climate change governance. And it doesn't have to be in the law discipline. It can be in the arts as an MA or an MSc, but it's important to work on creating this cohort of younger people that are coming up learning a lot of details around it. But I think that is not necessarily going to help to distribute knowledge on a wider scale. And it's therefore important to look at integration of climate knowledge into regular education. And if we speak at university level, One of the more difficult conversations with colleagues is how to get a colleague teaching banking law, for instance, to integrate elements around climate risk and concerning banking. And for instance, recently Kenya's central bank actually published regulations and guidelines requiring banks to take into consideration risks in terms of their balance sheet. So this is one of the ways to do it. And of course, specialist courses that we speak about, we do as part of CPDs, MOOCs, and others are important, but these courses are often going to volunteers. You know, there are people who already are interested in this, they are important, but we do need to think about how to reach the unusual constituent, the person whose actions have a tremendous impact on negative climate impact, but who is not necessarily given to understanding or being in places where climate change is being discussed. The people working on mining, petroleum, infrastructure, and such areas and so on. So perhaps those could help reinforce an approach to dealing with enhancing capacity building. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Robert. I know this is not a new field for you, and it's somewhere where you've been doing a lot of work, and we really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your experiences and your knowledge. I think the one thing I could add, and I think you underscored it very, very well, although I'm still thinking about how we could actually do experiential learning around how to screen a budget, because that would just be awesome session. But it's that there is, of course, now a law school in the world that offers an Indigenous law degree, a JID. And I've recently been in quite intense conversations with them because they've decided to sign up as one of the 24 UNITAR accredited CFAL SDG training centers as a university. And they said that one of the reasons they did that was because the Indigenous Law Lodge saw it as a no-brainer and made that very clear. And the Indigenous law professors in particular, most of whom are Indigenous lawyers, were very clear that this was something that they needed to do. So that direct local to global link that can be done when we're willing to think outside the box, but mainstream, but take over the existing institutions and turn them to purpose is huge. And I would like to, with that 1 minute introduction, turn to some of the questions that have come in online. Because Rosa and Nada are here, you can turn on your cameras, and they are willing to communicate to us the questions that have come in online. I should also underscore that these questions are not just coming to us, but they are also coming to the video of this session and the recommended resources of this session, which are going out to all 1,400 registrants, many of whom are in different time zones, or are needing translation to be able to be part of this. And so the answers are of interest to all of us. Nada, do we have any interesting questions on the Q&A?
Thank you, Professor Mary Claire. We have 3 questions. We have the first question from Shahinaz Atlam from Ain Shams University, Egypt. She's asking about how can we get the public sector to join forces and take part in capacity building efforts? Is it a good idea at all to ask public sector to do so, or should those efforts remain by the people, for the people, to guarantee its independence from any national policies? The second question from Ahmed, Ain Shams University, and Maha Omar, Al Mashriq Bank in Egypt as well. They're asking about how can we persuade businesses to voluntarily commit to climate action that may affect their profits, and how and what would be the tools to oblige them to, if necessary. The final question from Mohammed Afifi, the German University in Cairo, Egypt. He's asking about how can we encourage the targets of capacity building training, such as students, academic and judiciary members, to turn into leading actors in their respective fields. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask Barbara if she would like to jump in with training decision makers. And then I would love to also ask more generally, because of course this is something IDLO has done for decades. And then I'd like to give the other 2 questions to the other panelists, so you can already start thinking about which one you want to pick and answer. So Barbara, in terms of training decision makers, and I've been there with you.
Yes.
So.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's extremely crucial because the decision makers are people who very often don't really have the opportunity to learn about ongoing, as we spoke about before, evidence, right? So they don't have evidence, but they have the obligation to take the decision. Right now, we have these young decision makers with us here in Almaty. And it was really kind of moving when a person told me, oh, you know, actually, I did not know that. And this is a person being really involved into the transboundary negotiations of the water courses. And we know in Central Asia, it's like a hotspot of climate change, and so little data is available. And those people who are sitting over there and taking the decisions, they don't have the capacity because they cannot have. They are so understaffed. Very often they are very little paid. That was also raised up here as an issue, especially the young people. So instead of being getting more knowledge or getting involved, they have to take another opportunities to additionally earn money. So we are kind of obliged. And very often those people who also take decisions, they are for sure not lawyers. They are experts in the different fields, but they are mainly engineers with a very engineering background. Okay, maybe natural sciences, much more rare, sometimes economic background, and very rarely lawyers, especially if they arrive then later on the higher positions. They are rather politically driven. And I think that this is kind of our really obligation if we want to make this transition smooth, that we have to encourage them to trust that law is one of these tools. Rule of law is this way forward to secure the cooperation in the region. And maybe just one sentence. I was also happy that one of the questions came from German Egyptian University, because this is exactly the model which we run here in Almaty. That's the German Kazakh University, which is also with the regional scope. And I think that we all, because of the very much devoted German policy towards the zero net agenda, that's what we also could very well cooperate. So maybe this session, it's even one step towards offering the capacity building, between the regions, south-south cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. Ilaria, do you have anything to add? I know that you have trained judges and constitution writers as well as civil servants.
Thank you, Marie-Claire, and thank you all for the questions. Look, it's these are difficult questions. They go at the heart of what a capacity building should look like. And as IDLO, as you said, we have a long history of capacity building, but to be honest, we have to also ask ourselves, what is the impact of this capacity building training and various interventions and exercises? So if we want to have the impact that we desire on the beneficiaries, which is in effect to have real change in society, not only on climate, of course, but on a broader range of issues, we need to move from capacity building to empowering agents of change. So it's not just a question of knowledge sharing, and knowledge sharing in our experience has a very good value, but it could be limiting. So we need to really empower our target groups, if you want to call them like that, to become agents of change. Because one thing is to transfer knowledge, and knowledge can be transferred and can be even be evaluated after the training. You ask, has your knowledge improved? And they generally say yes. But then when you ask the more difficult question, okay, what is the impact that you have had on your community? That's a different story. So I would say move from capacity building to empowering agents of change, which requires a more holistic approach, and more generally getting the law closer to the people and having more people-centered approaches, involve communities, informal justice systems, and whoever has an influence at the community level. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, I've been warned that our session cuts out automatically, although lunch is right after hours, so we might be able to steal 2 extra minutes, just for 1 minute from Megan and 1 minute from Robert, and then I'll say thank you very, very much. And I'm already saying thank you, especially to Maeve and Tejas for their presentation and their ongoing work in this area out of Cambridge and internationally as part of the CLGI. So Megan and then Robert.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marie-Claire, and thank you so much for the questions. Wonderful questions. So my quick question is response is going to address the question about private sector and business, and how to persuade them to get on board. And really, the short answer is there's 2 ways you can do it. They're not mutually exclusive, and there's probably other ways, but let me just focus on 2. The first is to use law and regulation in a way that harnesses the business case, harnesses business case logic. And that can be done through, incentives, the provision of incentives, tax credits, green bonds, risk sharing, and guarantees, anything that can reduce the risk and help to improve the certainty of return. And of course, through disincentivizing or penalizing law and regulation, a carbon price, for example, would be in that field. And I mean, certainly we're seeing the rise of disclosure in this space as it can only ever be a first step. I really want to emphasize that disclosure is not a panacea for anything, but it is a first step just to get some data in the space and so that better decisions can start being made. But the final point I'm going to make is this: the second way is, of course, to just make tough decisions. And they are going to need to be made, and they need to be made sooner rather than later, because of course we need to not just be channeling more green money into green things, but we desperately need to be exponentially reducing the money that is flowing into polluting and unsustainable things. And that is going to take edicts and value choices and tough decisions.
Absolutely. In Cairo, they presented a model of how the Germans do it. If you cooperate, having lied on a disclosure, they'll reduce your fine by 50%. You'll still be under a plan, however, and you want to get out of that once you can. So yeah, foreclosure, right? If you don't cooperate with the authorities, it's worse. Robert, you have quite suitably the last word as we do the Africa Cup, please.
Well, thank you. I mean, I would say that there is need to rethink very carefully the idea of rule of law with respect to private sector behavior on climate change. And I say that because we are seeing instances where private sector actors, particularly the big polluters, have a say on the setting of policy because of the influence they have on elections of leaders across the world and contributions to campaigns. And so a much brighter lens ought to be focused on that aspect of rule of law in terms of how some of these rules are being made. And we've seen courts across the world say, no, the standards you set through that policy were grossly inadequate. And that in itself may be technically lawful, that private entities get law bars to act on, but it's still a violation of the rule of law to the extent that they already had an influence on how this was done in the first place. And this is very key, and that is more or less the same whether you're dealing with mitigation commitments and obligations, or whether you're dealing with climate proofing obligations to reduce vulnerability of critical infrastructure that is exposing people to disasters, etc. So I'd say we need to pay close attention to what the rule of law means in this era when we urgently need to take climate action. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a very, very profound point to end on. I'm going to say thank you to everyone. We see a wonderful question in the chat about PhDs and JIDs and other options for future studies. I'm going to invite the person who asked it to contact me directly. I notice you're in Cambridge, so I will take you for tea. I will try to invite Megan, and the best of us will give you an answer if we can, or at least those of us who are there will give you the best answer we can. So what I think I should say is that this is the beginning of a conversation. There are some very exciting steps afoot, not just with Iman Center, but also at Cambridge and globally. If at all possible, I would like to invite the people who participated in this panel to continue collaborating on these issues, exchanging ideas as climate law capacity strengtheners and as members of a community dedicated to bringing us up to that 6,000 somehow. I will say the good news is that we do have a network already of just under 11,000 who have been part of Climate Law and Governance Day over the last decade, now built. And we will be reaching out to them to ask them if they would be willing to register in order to be able to start building our 6,000. But a lot more is needed. And one thing that we can all do and our colleagues can do as well is to encourage our students as they graduate and become specialists to make climate law part of their practice. And ideally, even reach out to some of our alumni and also ask them to register as climate law and governance specialists. Because yeah, you look at the size of the criminal bar in just one country, and then you look at how many people we have who are able to advise on these issues in a qualified way globally, and it's not a gap, it's a chasm. It's a very profound chasm, and the more little tiny bridges, big bridges, medium-sized bridges we can build across it, the better. So thank you again to especially Iman, who is already being pulled into an extremely high-level meeting that we will all see on the news shortly. And also especially to Professor Barbara Janus-Pauleta as Vice Rector and Head of International Affairs and a professor at the German Kazakh University in Almaty, to Professor Robert Kibugi, who is a leader in the field and also, of course, professor in the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and to Dr. Megan Bowman, who is, of course, one of the most inspiring and hardest working heads of a climate law and governance center in the world, and a very dear collaborator. And I would especially like to thank our rapporteurs, the students who have joined us, everyone who has joined us online and stayed with us, cutting into their lunch, and end with a warmest of thanks to Ilaria for all the work that she's doing, for the amazing strategy that IDLO has come up with. And I'm biased, but it's brilliant. And I think that we have to continue this work, and we will do so. Thank you.